Hi everyone, how are we doing tonight? Good. Well, I'm here to introduce Karen Ehman. She's fantastic. She's sitting right over here. We are so blessed to have her at Bethany House. We love what she does. We love her books. We hope that you will all continue to enjoy her books, especially with her new book coming out this March, Trusting God in All the Things, a new devotional, and we're so excited for it. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about Karen. We'll pray and then we'll bring her on up. All right, so Karen is a New York Times bestselling author with P31 Ministries, and she has written 16 books and counting, and we're so blessed to have her, so please bow your heads and we'll pray real quick. Dear God, thank you so much for bringing us all together this day. Thank you for all the women in this room, all who have joined us online, and thank you especially for Karen. Thank you for all who are weathering the weather. Thank you for the hands that have prepared this wonderful event. And God, bless Karen with the words that you have given her. Let her feel encouraged and let her speak to the women here today, encourage them and bless them in all she has to say from the words given by you. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for everything that you've done, for giving us your son, and for giving us the wonderful Karen. Amen. Karen.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's not raining over in Lansing, it's not even snowing, but it is doing both here. But that was okay, because I was going to see all of you. And let's be honest, I was going to get to go to Trader Joe's before I came here, so that's a second reason for me to be here tonight. So thank you so much for coming. We're going to have fun. Just a little bit of a talk for me, and then we're going to get to do the fun gift basket thing, which I'm looking forward to. Well, my favorite thing in the entire universe, if you were to ask me what it is, I would say it's a 4-year-old boy. I had 2 boys, and I loved when they were 4 years old. I just loved how they were so inquisitive, and they always had their little chocolate milk mustache on their upper lip and a slingshot in their back pocket, and rocks and worms and whatever, Hopefully they wouldn't be using the slingshot on their siblings, they would just be doing a little target practice. But I love 4-year-old boys, especially I think because in my house, at least, both of my boys constantly asked me a one-word question. What is it? Why? Why? Yes, why, Mama? Why are bananas yellow, but they're not red? Because apples are red, but they're also yellow. Or, Mama, why is there no ham in hamburger? Which is actually a really good question when you think about it. 4-year-old boys love to ask why. I remember going to a speaking event in Minnesota. We dropped off our 3 kids in Upper Wisconsin at my Aunt Patty's house so she could watch them while Todd and I went. Oh, there's my husband, Todd. Say hi. I forgot to introduce you. I'm sorry. He just had knee replacement surgery. That's why he stole an ottoman. So nobody take his ottoman or he'll be okay. But one time, Todd and I went to Minnesota for one of my speaking engagements. My kids stayed with my Aunt Patty. And my Aunt Patty said, my son Mitchell, who was 4 at the time, drove her nuts, following her around her house, just saying, asking, why, Aunt Patty, why, for an entire 4 days. She said she finally realized she could keep him quiet if she just kept feeding him bacon. So she said, like 2 pounds of bacon in 4 days. But the question of why is just something that we all in life want to know. Like, why are we here? What is the whole point? I remember being in college at Spring Arbor University, and we had to write a project for our Philosophy 200 class, and it was called Your Summum Bonum. It was basically your big why. Why do you think we are here on Earth? It's the one chief end of all things on Earth that ties it all together and gives you your big why. And our professor said we couldn't pick God. We couldn't just say God. We had to go a little deeper. And so I decided that I was going to choose relationships. Just 3 years prior to this, I became a Christian through a woman that was a youth pastor's wife at our church. And she had told me that she felt like there were really only 2 reasons that we were here on Earth. And they both had to do with relationships. She said the first reason was to have a relationship with God, who offers us a place in heaven through his son Jesus and his death, burial, and resurrection. And the second reason we're here is to have relationships with other people so we can tell them how they too can have a relationship with God. So our relationship with God, our relationship with others, only reason we're here on earth, our big why. So I whipped out my canary yellow legal pad, which is how we rolled back in the day. I did have a typewriter. I called my laptop a typewriter the other day. It was terrible. I'm showing my age. But I took that legal pad and I wrote out my summa bonum, my big why, relationships. And you know, the longer I'm here on earth, the more convinced I am that really life is all about relationships. Relationships with family, with friends, coworkers, neighbors, even strangers. They are our big why. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, because I think it often too, but relationships take so much time. It just takes so much time. There are people that are critical and combative, and you know, that's just in my own four walls. There's other people outside my four walls. Well, we are going to take a little time tonight to look at somebody for whom relationships were greatly important. He was never too busy to pour into them. You know, I never get tired of reading through the Gospels, even though I love to read both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I even every January, like a lot of you, I start out with one of those read through the Bible, right? Read through the Bible in a year, but you kind of fizzle by February kind of plans. Even though I love reading the entire Bible, I would be perfectly happy to just sit and soak in the scriptures that tell what Jesus did when he was here on earth. Although he was the Son of God on a very big mission, he was never too busy to notice. He lived alert. He could be in a crowd of hundreds, if not thousands of people, and somehow he would turn his attention to one simple soul who needed a word from him or a touch from him. Because you know, Jesus wasn't really about doing big things, he was about doing the right thing. And often the right thing was noticing just one person. So we're gonna take a little look in Mark 5. I have it here for you, so you don't need to get it on your phone or anything. I'm gonna read it for you. In Mark 5, but I wanna set up the scene just a little bit. Jesus had just healed a demon-possessed man, which I'm sure was something very grand that he was doing. It probably was trending on Twitter. But then he crossed over to the other side of the lake with his disciples, and as often happened, a huge crowd gathered around. There was a ruler of the synagogue there whose name was Jairus. He was among one of the many people who wanted to see Jesus, and he had a rather desperate request. His daughter lay dying and he longed for Jesus to come heal her. So this is Mark 5, starting in verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. And I just love those 5 words. So Jesus went with him. He didn't, take a lot of time to explain anything. He didn't draw attention to himself, posting it on social media with a hashtag miracle on the way, watch what I'm about to do. He just stopped when he saw someone in their pain and he went with them. I wonder how many people in our lives could use us to just stop what we're doing and go with them in their pain. Pick up reading here in verse 24 of Mark 5. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." This story has always fascinated me, how Jesus took the time in the middle of that crowd to notice just one person and meet her need. And she was a seemingly insignificant person when you think about it. She wasn't important like the synagogue ruler Jairus. We're told not only what he did for a living, he was a synagogue ruler, but we're told his name, Jairus. We're not told what this woman did in her life. We're not even told her name, but she wasn't unimportant to Jesus. Now, Jairus became a little worried that the side trip might have taken up a little too much time, and it was too late for his daughter, but it's never too late. For Jesus, he still journeyed on and healed his daughter instead. You know, often in life, we are on our way to do something grand, right? We're gonna be in charge of something at work or at church, or maybe our kids or our grandkids are starring in something. We feel like we're helping in ministry, and those are all great things. But sometimes I wonder, who are we walking past on our way to do something big for Jesus, but we're too busy to notice and too focused to care? One time, many years ago, because the baby that was on my hip is now 23 years old and 6'5" and a UFC fighter in training. So this was a long time ago. When Spencer was a baby, I had him on my hip. I was given a spelling test to our daughter who was in the 1st grade, and toddler Mitchell was playing around on the floor. And I was listening to the radio. And a pastor was on. I wish I could remember who it was so I could give him credit, but I'll never forget what he said. He was teaching on this exact passage, and he said, often for Jesus, real ministry, it wasn't the great big thing he was about to go to with all the crowds. For Jesus, real ministry was the person he found standing in front of him. Who is that for you today? For me back then, it was my 3 little kids. Now in my life, it's more adults. In fact, in the recent past, it's been a lot of my son that I just mentioned, who is 23 now. It was he and a lot of his friends. In fact, often on a Friday night, I would be working in my office, you know, kind of tying up some things from the week, and it's down the hallway from the kitchen, but to go down the hallway to get to the kitchen, to get another cup of coffee to help me as I keep working, I will pass the entryway to our house and the stairs that go down to our man cave, you know, where there's the TV and the boys love to have their sweet chili Doritos and whatever other snacks they're having. And sometimes I would come out of that office to go get another cup of coffee, and I would see, I wish I had a picture, but I would see this big pile of shoes in our entryway. I mean, like over a dozen pair of shoes. And I wouldn't even know anybody was home because I was probably working with earphones in and didn't hear anybody. And about that time, my son will bound up the stairs and give me a kiss on the cheek, and I'll say the same thing to him every time. Oh, hey, you're home. Who'd you bring with you? Who'd you bring with you? And he'll rattle off, you know, me and Leo and Anthony and Jordan and Javari and Butcher and Blake and second Blake and Grant and second Grant, because there's 2 Blakes and there's 2 Grants, so that's how I refer to them. And I'll always say, oh, hey, you're home. Who'd you bring with you? And I just never know who it's going to be. Well, that pile of shoes is kind of representative of the people in my life that are standing before me. And not too long ago, I was on my way to do something grand. I was about ready to write a book. It's called Listen, Love, Repeat, Other-Centered Living in a Self-Centered World. And it's all about noticing that person standing in front of you. Well, that pile of shoes didn't go away usually till the next morning, because a lot of time those guys would just bed down in our basement downstairs. They'd crash after they watched the game, and I loved having them. I didn't mind it. Our grocery bill was a little high, but other than that, I loved having them around. When my kids were teenagers, Todd and I were kind of the philosophy that they're going to hang out with other people anyway, and might as well be at our house, right? So we can keep, look at all the heads nodding. Yeah, so you can keep tabs on it. You can listen through that register in your office to listen down and see what's going on, right? Well, there was one pair of shoes in that pile that belonged to who I call Second Grant. He was the second guy in this gang of guys that had just moved to the community. His name was also Grant, so he couldn't go by First Grant. I called him Second Grant. And I didn't know a ton about him. I kind of stalked him a little bit on social media. Wasn't too sure if I wanted our son to hang out at his house. There's some things I saw, but I was happy to have him hang out at our house. And I like to try to get up early on Saturdays, especially at this time. My son is now out of high school, but this was when he was a senior. I would like to get up early on Saturday morning so I could get a bunch of work done on my writing and not be taking time away from my family. And I knew I was probably good till at least 10 o'clock. Now those boys were going to wake up and want their homemade whole grain oatmeal waffles from Miss Karen until at least 10. So I was good. So I would get up 6, 7 o'clock, take my laptop, go sit out by the fire in the living room, and I'd start working on that book about noticing that person right in front of you. The only trouble was second Grant was an early riser. So I would hear him coming up the stairs, and he, like me, loved coffee. So he would go raid my very favorite flavor. Do you have any coconut mocha coffee, Miss Karen? And he'd have a cup of coffee from the Keurig, and he would plop down right next to me on the couch as I had my laptop out, ready to just get like 3 hours to myself. And he'd say, "Hey, what you doing?" And I would be like, I'm trying to work on a book about noticing the person right in front of you if you'll leave me alone. And it was then I clearly felt like God was saying, "Oh, I get it, Karen. You want to give the message. You just don't want to live the message." He's so bossy sometimes, but he's always right. And that was right. I was so busy wanting to write about this message, I wasn't really living it. So I would shut my laptop and he bounded up the stairs, and he and I would sit there and have a cup of coconut mocha coffee. He always got a side of sermon with whatever else I was feeding that day. That those boys always know. You're going to get Miss Karen's homemade corn chowder, but it's going to come with a side of sermon. I would always try to work in the gospel, work in Jesus however I could. Well, after about 9 months of knowing second Grant, one day he popped up early in the morning, sat by me, and he said, "Hey, I wanted to ask you, what are you and Mr. Ehman doing the third Sunday in March?" And I thought, oh, must be there's some big game on TV, and he wants me to make some particular snack, array for the big game. And I said, "Well, let me look." I looked at my phone. I said, "I'm not out speaking. I'm home. Why? Is there a big game on?" And he said, "No." And I nearly fell over at the next thing he said. He said, "I've been listening to those little side sermons you give us. And I've actually been talking to a youth pastor at the church up the street. And I'm actually getting baptized that night because I've accepted Christ. And I want you and Mr. Ehman to be there in the front row." And I just about lost it. And I thought, oh my goodness, I almost missed it. We don't do anything in bringing someone to salvation. We just get a front row seat watching God draw them to himself. But we went to the baptism that night. It wasn't only him, but it was his brother and his mother, who all three got baptized that night. And I was sitting there bawling my eyes out, wishing I had, waterproof mascara on. And I thought, I'm so glad that I stopped and I noticed that person standing right in front of me. Who is that for you? Who do you find throughout the week standing right in front of you? And if you want to behave in a way where relationships are your why, well, what do you do? How do you behave? Well, one little relationship skill I'm going to talk about right now is something I saw my mom do very well. She's passed away in April. I'm not going to get through this without crying. But I never knew what it was called until my husband and I were in a small group with a group leader named Michael. And he had a term for what my mom used to do. My mom used to be so good at just like listening between the lines to somebody if they would say something that was their favorite, or if they would say they had some medical test the next Thursday and they were a little worried about it. My small group leader, Michael, called this hearing a heart drop. It's like someone gives you a little peek into their heart without really saying it. You're just kind of listening between the lines. And my mom was so good at that. She had a philosophy of life that said, whenever you felt like things were not going your way, I remember being in middle school once, and I think I was upset because I didn't get invited to the slumber party or something. And she said, "You know what, honey, whenever you feel like circumstances aren't going your way and you're down in the dumps and you're depressed, you need to remember this. There's always someone out there who has life worse off than you. So find that person and do something to make their day." So she was always on the lookout for these heart drops, where someone would give her a little peek into something that was going on. My husband actually listened to her little heart drop once and did something kind of big for me when I turned 30, which was, like just like 2 years ago, maybe. He was a youth pastor at the time, and I loved to help with the senior high youth group. And the girls were all gathered around me one day because the big slumber party was coming up. And they were talking about it, and they said, "Oh, hey, Karen, tell us, what were slumber parties like way back in the late 80s? Like I'm so old." And I just simply said, I went to a few, but I never had a slumber party because my mom was a single mom living on a budget, so tight it squeaked. And we just didn't have a nice house. We didn't even have any living room furniture in our house. And she never let me have people over. I never had a friend spend the night, never had a slumber party. My husband, he heard that little heart drop. And so he contacted my two best friends, Susie and Debbie, and the three of them met like at 5 in the morning at some restaurant to plan out a 30th birthday party, surprise slumber party for me. There were 30 friends at my 30th birthday at the church. In fact, there was one lady there, she was like in her late 80s, early 90s, her name was Gladys. And she didn't get the memo of dressing up in your pajamas, because you're supposed to dress up in your pajamas. In fact, when Debbie and Susie kidnapped me, they were in their bathrobes with curlers in their hair. Debbie actually had really long hair. She rolled her hair up in orange juice cans, and they got stopped by the cops because they were speeding on the way to my house. It was so funny. She said that one officer had a hard time holding it together. But Gladys didn't get the memo, and she was in her Sunday best with her curls on. She had this little hat on and one of those blowers, honkers blowers, and they're so cute because they said surprise when I walked in, and I was blindfolded, and she's like, "Oh my dear, I do declare, I don't think I've ever blown a honker before." It was a little heart drop. You can be listening, not even just for things that maybe indicate that someone's sad, but just for random pieces of information that you might use in the future that you don't really know how you're going to use it, but you might use it. For example, my friend Tammy, she and I went out to coffee once, and she's kind of like me. She has a very high maintenance coffee order. And so after she gave her high maintenance coffee order, when I got out to my car, I wrote it down, I remembered it, and I wrote it down and put it in my phone. Didn't know how I was going to use it. This was like in probably February or March. Well, fast forward to September, they took their only child to college, dropped him off. She came back home. I knew that next day was going to be a hard day for her, because that school bus was going to go by into her house, reminding her that her son was now far, far away. And so I went to the coffee house. I got her high maintenance coffee order and a box of tissues, and I showed up at her door, and I rang her doorbell. And I said, "Hey, I thought maybe you could use a friend and a shoulder to cry on." And she's like, "Oh, you're so sweet. I'm having such a hard morning." And I handed her the coffee, and she said, "What did you bring me, a mocha?" And I said, "No, I brought you a," and I rattled off that really, really long high maintenance coffee order. And she said, "How did you know?" I said, "Because silly, I wrote it down in my phone. You know, I captured it in my phone. The last time we had coffee way back in the spring." Another thing I love to do that you guys can start doing now is whenever you go to a funeral, take home the program from the funeral, and then write on your calendar or in your Google Calendar, however it is you keep a calendar, what day would have been the person who passed away's birthday, and maybe an anniversary if it says, you know, they married the love of their life on such and such day, and then use that information when those days come around. I did this for my friend Debbie. Her father passed away in September. His birthday was in April. She was extremely close to her dad, and every April on his birthday, she would show up at his house with a homemade carrot cake, and they'd go walking 2 miles, because until he was in his early 90s, he walked 2 miles a day. Well, I knew that first birthday without him was going to be hard. So I showed up on the front door of her farmhouse with my walking shoes on and a homemade carrot cake. She answered the door, and I didn't even say anything. She just started bawling. And she said, "How did you know?" I said, "Because I took the program home from the funeral home." Another time I did it for somebody else in our family whose husband had passed away. They'd been married for, I think it was 63 years. They were in their 80s, and Grandpa Don passed away and Grandma Alma was left behind. My boys were little at the time, so we went to Kroger. Doesn't need to cost a lot of money. We got a dozen roses on clearance for $2. Beautiful red roses, nothing wrong with them. And we went in May. He passed away Thanksgiving weekend. We went in May on what would have been their next anniversary. And my boys rang her doorbell. I hid around the bush because I wanted to kind of watch it all go down. And she answered the door, and they said, "Hi, Grandma Alma. Grandpa Don's too busy up in heaven today with Jesus. So he had us bring him some flowers for your anniversary." And she lost it. And again, she said, "How did you know?" We're like, "Because we just take that little folder, that little brochure program, whatever you want to call it, home from the funeral home, and record those dates. And then you can do something for somebody to make their day." Now, there's a category of people I like to call necessary people that we have in our lives. We've talked about why we're here on earth, relationships. Well, let's talk about who can we do things for? I like to do things for the necessary people. One time, our kids, when they were little, we decided to declare a day in the spring, Mr. Brown Day. Mr. Brown was our mailman, and he didn't just deliver the mail, he also delivered hugs and smiles. He was never too busy to visit. The only thing that kind of bothered me about Mr. Brown is sometimes the mail was late because he was visiting with everybody on the block, you know, the widow down the block, the little kids that were dressed up in their dance recital outfits or their T-ball uniforms. He'd want to sit and talk to them. And we loved Mr. Brown. So it was about the same time that I heard on the radio about Jesus's real ministry was the person standing in front of him. So we talked to our kids about that concept and said, who stands in front of us every day that we might be able to do something nice for them to make their day? And our oldest, Kenna, she said, Mr. Brown. So we brainstormed with the kids. Baby Spencer was a little too young to know what was going on. But Mackenzie and Mitchell were very excited to go down to the dollar store. We bought a squirt gun to ward off the dogs with for Mr. Brown. And we made some cookies and some lemonade. They bought him a What Would Jesus Do, a WWJD bracelet. And then they thought that we should get a gift certificate to the nicest restaurant in town so he could take Mrs. Brown out for a nice meal. So we went to the Dairy Queen and we got a gift certificate, which they thought was the nicest restaurant in town. And we hid inside our front door. We had streamers and honkers and blowers and all kinds of stuff and a banner. And when he rounded the corner that day, we jumped out on our front porch and we said, surprise, it's Mr. Brown, best mailman in town. Today is officially Mr. Brown Day. And he was like, oh, what is all of this? You know, he couldn't believe it. So we gave him his cookies and his lemonade and all his little gifts. And he laughed at the Dairy Queen gift certificates. And then he went on his way. And I really didn't think much more about it until a few days later, when I was once again cleaning the fingerprints off my picture window on the front porch. I had my back turned to the sidewalk and I heard him coming up the sidewalk. I heard his shoes. It was a really sunny day. I turned around, he had his sunglasses on, and I remember him taking his sunglasses off and saying, well, hey, Karen, I just have to tell you something. I am still not over Mr. Brown Day. And then he said this, do you know that I have been a mailman in this town on this block for 33 years, and nobody has ever done anything like what your family did for me. Sure, they give me something at Christmas, but nobody ever stopped on a random Tuesday afternoon to tell me thank you for what I did. Now, it's not that our family is such a great family. It took us 8 years to think of the idea. We lived in that house for 8 years. But there are necessary people. They're necessary to your life. They bring you your mail. They make your high maintenance coffee drink. They teach your children. They scan your groceries. They put your money in the bank. What can you do for them? I think of doing for others what we would like to have done for us. Well, what would some people like to have done for them? Like the UPS or FedEx workers. What would they like? On our porch, we have a basket with a bunch of snacks in it and a little sign that says, hey, you, yes, you, take a snack or two. And they can take a snack when they're in a busy day. You know what it's like in Michigan in the summer with all the potholes and all the construction going on. Instead of grumbling under your breath, have some cold bottles of water and some little packs of trail mix. And when you slow down in one of those construction zones, give some to a worker. There are a lot of necessary people we could do things for. When our kids were little, Mitchell, our middle child, he loved what he called busy machines, like any worker that was out working on the power lines with a bucket truck or an aerial lift, I guess is what they're called. You know all the technical names for him. And he knew that if he had a treat, they would let him watch them work. So I used to keep balls of frozen cookie dough in my freezer, and I'd make some cookies. He'd take fresh hot baked cookies out there and say, can I watch your busy machine? And they let him sit on the curb and watch him. They also one time wanted to do something for the garbage man. We had this awesome garbage man. This is like 20 years ago. And he always had his Walkman, it was actually like a Walkman then before iPods, with these little earphones in, and he would like twirl around and dance and throw the lid in the air, and he loved his job. And so one day they wanted me to leave some brownies out for the garbage man. So of course I wrapped them tightly and sat on top of the garbage can because I didn't want it to, you know, get contaminated or whatever. And we put a note on it that said, we love watching you do your job, you rock. And he loved it. So think about those necessary people in your life. What could you do to make their day? I love this perspective from Charles Spurgeon. He said this, serve God by doing common actions in a heavenly spirit. And then, if your daily calling only leaves you cracks and crevices of time, fill them up with holy service. You can learn to love your life. Life can be an adventure if you are, like my mom suggested, always on the lookout for someone who has life worse off than you, and you want to do something to make their day. Because you know what usually happens is we do the opposite, right? Especially on social media. We're scrolling through looking at all the people who we think have life better than us. Wow. Looks like they went out to a romantic restaurant. Must be nice. Seems like she has a wonderful marriage. oh, look at that brand new house they built. Seems like they have the perfect life. Or maybe as you are scrolling through social media, you see that your friend posts that their child just got student of the month at the local middle school, and they should, that's great. They should, tell people about that and be proud of it. But it seems like by comparison, your child's not doing so great because you just took a phone call from the vice principal of the middle school where your son sits busted in his office for a prank that he and his friends thought was completely hilarious that involved firecrackers and a substitute teacher. Not that I ever have any experience with that one. But we look at everybody else and it seems like they have a better life. We're coming apart at the seams. We need to quit looking at people who have life better than us and go look for that person who surely doesn't have life as well as we do. Both of my mamas were right. My spiritual mom, who led me to the Lord and said that we're only here for our relationships on earth and our relationship with God, and my earthly mom, who said that we should find that person who has life worse off than us and do something to make their day. And the next time we're all together again in a group with all of us will probably be when we're in heaven. And I like to imagine what God will say to us. I don't think he's going to say, did you have that great project at work that went wonderfully? Did you get to be in charge of that event at church? Did you raise fantastic children or grandchildren? I think instead, God's going to say something along the lines of what I used to say when I saw that big pile of shoes in my front door. Oh, hey, you're home. Who'd you bring with you? Who'd you bring with you? Thanks so much for listening. Does anybody have any questions? He said we take a little time for questions and I will sip some water because my mouth's getting dry. If not, we'll go on to the next part. You don't have to. Anybody have any ideas? Or any ideas that you want to go
I
ahead?
laughed at how much you talk about middle school because I am spending my 32nd year as a teacher in middle school. So I laugh at how much you mentioned middle school.
Lots of fun goes on in this. Actually, I used to be a substitute teacher and I loved being in middle school. I was like one of the only substitute teachers that requested to be in the middle school. But Todd was a youth pastor back then and the kids were always pretty good for me. But most of the substitute teachers begged not to be there. But I love them. They're squirrely. They're fun. Yeah. Or not even questions, but do any of you guys have any ideas of things to do for necessary people or people in your life? Going once, going twice.